The Bible often mentions tribes that seemingly have no other purpose than to give the Israelis someone to slaughter. We know almost nothing about these people from the Bible, except that they did something to get themselves killed. What if we're not only wrong about the existence of God, but it turns out that the sole reason God created us was so that some alien species, which really is his chosen people, had someone to kill when they got here to Earth?
You don't have to be poor anymore. Jesus is here.
The loudspeaker spoke up and said, Christianity is stupid.
This is the Atheist in the Trailer Park Podcast. I'm your host, Tucker. Professor Fuzznuts is busy demanding attention. Aren't you a little shithead? Come here. Ow, ow. Don't claw. Yes, it's a podcast hosted by a guy and his cat. Get over it. If you happen to like the podcast, you can follow it on Twitter. T-Park Atheist is the show's Twitter handle, and it's also on Facebook at facebook.com/trailerparkatheist. You can email me at trailerparkatheist@gmail.com. The show notes can be found at tparkatheist.blogspot.com. If you like the show, please rate it on iTunes. This is a news show episode where I cover stories in the news that are related to things like atheism, secularism, science, or I find just plain interesting. Next episode may be a chapter from Bible myths and their parallels in other religions. This one, I've got a bunch to go over, and if I don't get it all in this episode, I'm going to cut another one this weekend. So, you may get 2 news episodes. You may not get anything at all if there we go. Fuzznuts couldn't make up his mind where he wanted to be. All right, so let's get to the news. And now, a look at what's happening with religion. I'm going to apologize in advance because this story gets me really worked up for some reason. I don't know exactly why that is. Because of that, I may not get to cover too many other stories in this episode, and as I'm probably going to spend a good portion of this episode just frothing at the mouth over what happened in this story. It comes from BBC News. Iran. Happy video dancers sentenced to 91 lashes and jail. 6 Iranians arrested for appearing in a video dancing to Pharrell Williams' song Happy have been sentenced up to 1 year in prison and 91 lashes, their lawyer says. The sentences were suspended for 3 years, meaning they will not go to prison unless they reoffend. I'm just going to interject. Doesn't seem to be anything about them not getting the lashes. So, I don't know if they're going to get beat or not, but it's fucking bullshit either way. Okay, back to the story. The video shows 3 men and 3 unveiled women dancing on the streets and rooftops of Tehran. In 6 months, it has been viewed by over 1 million people on YouTube. The majority of people involved in the video were sentenced to 6 months in prison, with one member of the group given 1 year. Lawyer Farshid Rufgaran was quoted by Iran Wire as saying, "The Happy We Are from Tehran video was brought to the attention of the Iranian authorities in May after receiving more than 150,000 views. Members of the group behind the video were subsequently arrested by Iranian police for violating Islamic laws of the country, which prohibit dancing with members of the opposite sex and women from appearing without a headscarf." I don't know if you've seen the video in question, but I'll put a link to it in the show notes. That anyone could be offended by what happens in the video should be infuriating to people with common sense. First of all, I've seen more risque behavior in an Annette Funicello Gidget movie. For those of you under 30, it's what your grandfather used to jerk off to before cable TV and the internet were invented. Secondly, while I know that they claim they were duped into performing in the video. If they're acting, then it's the best performance of being authentically enthralled with being alive I've ever seen. Really, I know lots of people don't necessarily like the song, but you just watch it and it's like, my God, they really are happy. And they're having a good time. And, you know, they're being punished for it. I know lots of people will point to the fact that Iran is a country controlled by Islamic fundamentalists like the Ayatollah, but that misses the root cause of the issue. Blaming Islam overlooks the root cause of the problem, and that is the combination of political power being held by religious nut jobs. And I really should clarify there, it's the combination of political and religious power being held by religious nut jobs. But don't take my word for it. Let me read to you what Barry "We Should Nuke Vietnam" Goldwater said about the religious right in the U.S. in the 1980s. On religious issues, there can be little or no compromise. There is no position on which people are so immovable as their religious beliefs. There is no more powerful ally one can claim in a debate than Jesus Christ or God or Allah or whatever one calls this supreme being. But like any powerful weapon, the use of God's name on one's behalf should be used sparingly. The religious factions that are growing throughout our land are not using their religious clout with wisdom. They are trying to force government leaders into following their position 100%. If you disagree with these religious groups on a particular moral issue, they complain, they threaten you with a loss of money or votes or both. I'm frankly sick and tired of the political preachers across this country telling me as a citizen that if I want to be a moral person, I must believe in A, B, C, and D. Just who do they think they are? And from where do they presume to claim the right to dictate their moral beliefs to me? And I am even more angry as a legislator who must endure the threats of every religious group who thinks it has some God-granted right to control my vote on every roll call in the Senate. I am warning them today. I will fight them every step of the way if they try to dictate their moral convictions to all Americans in the name of conservatism. For those of you under 30, Barry Goldwater was a Republican senator from Arizona who was often seen as extreme in his conservatism. And Vietnam was your grandfather's Iraq, only the guy who got us into Vietnam made sure that us ordinary folks benefited as well by creating things like Medicaid and the space program. And yes, Goldwater seriously consider nuking Vietnam. Indeed, that was how he lost in '64, was because Lyndon Johnson had perhaps the most powerful political ad anybody's ever seen. It was just a little girl in a field playing, picking flowers, and you hear a countdown followed by the footage of a nuclear explosion. That's all it was, and it scared people into voting for Johnson over Goldwater. And sadly, Goldwater and even fucking Richard Nixon are both preferable Republicans to many of the ones in power today. Okay, but the point is that the reason Islam seems so violent in comparison to other religions is because right now there isn't even the thin veneer of separating church and state in many Islamic countries like there is in the U.S. There's also some selection bias involved, but I'll get to that. I don't know about you, but many times in my Facebook feed or in emails, I'll get comments from people who will claim that this country would be better off if we followed biblical law. Granted, many of these people don't actually understand what biblical law is, but if you point out that it can include things like beheadings for those convicted of murder and amputations for those convicted of theft, they'll happily point to places like Saudi Arabia, which do such things, and make claims that those countries have a very low crime rate. How true it might be that the Saudis have a low crime rate, I've no idea. Were there to be a presidential candidate who advocated such things, they'd vote for him and really not care anything at all for what else he stood for. They subscribe to the belief that if you get tough on crime, it'll go away. Now imagine that you lived in a country where corruption in one form or another was rampant. say Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, or even Saudi Arabia. You're going to feel pretty powerless, and someone offering a dramatic solution to the problem of crime is going to be hugely appealing to you. Sure, you might know in the back of your head that these assholes are going to do shit that you oppose, say banning the sale of alcohol, but your hope is going to be that by following religious law, you'll be able to put a stop to the corruption in your society. Once that's done, then you can work on getting things like booze legalized again. So you tell yourself. Unfortunately, this overlooks the fact that power is a corrupting influence, and that once people get power over other humans, they're unlikely to give it up. So they acquiesce to the nutbags in hopes that things will get better for them. Once they do, they discover that there's no hope of instilling rationality on the nutters, and they just quietly accept the fact that they're fucked. Meanwhile, having been empowered by their successes, the nutbags become arrogant and aggressive and seek to expand their powers by a greater measure. Now, before you think that this is just limited to those folks in Islamic countries, take a look at the U.S. Not only do we have nutbags like the Phelps clan who'd be more than happy to go back to beheadings as a punishment, but we have folks like Gordon Klingenschmidt in Colorado, who isn't merely a nutter who thinks that gays should be punished, but is also likely to get elected to office. The damage he's going to be able to do is limited, since there's not nearly as many crazies in the Colorado State Assembly as there are in the provincial governments of places like Iraq. But that doesn't mean Klingenschmidt is going to be completely harmless either. No doubt he'll oppose any pro-gay, pro-pot, or any other policy which is based on rationality. Are laws banning pot and other illegal drugs really all that different than Sharia law? Sure, we don't execute someone for smoking weed or doing heroin, but we lock them up and damage their earning potential by saddling them with a criminal record. This is despite the fact that there's ample evidence showing that legalization or decriminalization dramatically lowers the use of illicit drugs and doesn't reduce the earning potential of those who use the drugs because they're not saddled with a criminal record for the rest of their lives. What happens if we continue to create a marginalized underclass who have no hope of making a decent wage because instead of getting drunk, they chose to get high? Did you know that some studies have shown the places in Pakistan which have the highest support for groups like Al-Qaeda are not the poor areas, but the middle-class ones? The poor are opposed to Al-Qaeda because it's the poor who keep getting blown up, while the middle class sits safely behind the walls of their gated communities. Sounds kind of familiar, doesn't it? As for the selection bias I mentioned earlier, right now we pay attention to part of what happens in the Islamic world because we're best buds with Israel, and we have forces in combat in the Mideast. But as someone who tries to find stories about what's going on in other parts of the world, I can tell you it's not easy to get a decent picture. Part of it is because I'm your typical stupid American who doesn't know anything about the rest of the world, but part of it is also that our mainstream media outlets don't bother reporting such things. Right now in Myanmar, the government is apparently engaging in ethnic cleansing against the Muslim minority in parts of the country. This is a Buddhist nation killing and jailing people because they're Muslim. Is it somehow better when your village is bulldozed and burned to the ground by government forces than when it's done by religious fundamentalists? Is it any less of a religious-based hate crime in that circumstance? And this isn't the only place where this kind of thing has occurred. Sri Lanka is another country where the government is dominated by one religious group and has used overwhelming military force to kill members of another religious group. Then let's not forget, 20 years ago, we saw the same thing in the former Yugoslavia with various religious groups ganging up on each other. That, yes, there were some ethnic overtones in there as well, but it wasn't completely an ethnic-based conflict, even though it was presented as that in the media. There are also incidences in Malaysia, the Philippines, South and Central America, where the government is dominated by members of one religious group, and they've gone out and killed people who were in a different religious group. These are rarely called religious oppression since there's often other factors involved, such as a land grab for natural resources located in an area, or differing political affiliations, and neither side can be considered a completely innocent party in these events. But the fact remains that when you look at those groups involved, when their dispute is with someone who shares the same religious beliefs as them, their first response usually isn't to immediately start bombing the shit out of the other guy. Yet we don't blame such actions, except in rare cases, on this or that particular religion. We seem to think that if a government is involved, their actions, no matter how wrong they might be, aren't motivated by religion. Given how devout many people are and how important God is in their life, can we really say that it's impossible that the justification for their action doesn't trace back to religion, especially when the people they're oppressing are of a different religion? I'm sorry to go on about this, as I've said before. For whatever reason, that story about those kids in Iran getting whipped for starring in that stupid music video really upsets me. Shortly after I read that, I listened to Noah Lujan's diatribe on the latest Scathing Atheist about Muslims and Islam, and it just rubbed me the wrong way for some reason. Noah's a great guy, and I probably owe half my listeners to him, but I think his pinning the award of the most violent religion today on Islam is a bit simplistic. Sure, there are problems with Islam being a violent religion, but there are also problems with every other religion operating in the world today being violent. We just notice Islam because they flew a couple of planes into some buildings. We don't notice the Christians persecuting gays in places like Uganda or Russia, or what's happening in Myanmar, or the fact that the anti-drug laws in the U.S. can be traced back to the Puritan ideals of no fun at any time for anyone ever.
Oh, gracious me. Was I raving? Please forgive me. I'm mad.
Okay, I'm going to move on to the next story now. Not sure how many other news stories I'm going to get to put out in this episode, but if I have time, I'll put out another podcast this weekend with the stories that don't make it into this one, assuming I have time to cut a Bible Myths episode, which kind of contradicts what I said earlier, but you get the idea. If things go well, you'll get 3 episodes this weekend. If things don't go well, you'll probably only get 2. This story comes from the Daily Mail. Terrified 5-year-old boy has his eyes gouged out with spoon by his mother and 5 relatives in satanic ritual. A Mexican family has been jailed for gouging out the eyes of their 5-year-old relative with a spoon during a satanic ritual to bring about the end of the world. Gosh. They're not Islamic. I don't think. Actually, I know they're not, but we'll get to that in a minute. Fernando Caleb Alvarado Rios was ordered to close his eyes out of respect with his mother, grandparents, aunt, and uncles as they danced in a circle and called on Satan to reveal himself. But when he was too scared to do so, his mother, Maria del Carmen Garcia Rios, grabbed a spoon and the entire group gouged them out. They were caught when neighbors who had heard loud chanting came to investigate and saw the child screaming in pain. Today, more than 2 years after the incident in May 2012, a court has sentenced the group to 30 years each in jail. Now, it is the Daily Fail, so not exactly a trustworthy news source. There are, however, photos and video with the article, so it's not complete bullshit. I think, however, that they got the Satanist part a little wrong. In Mexico, things have gotten so shitty with the drug war, which, remember what I said earlier, that people have decided that the only solution is to call in exorcists, or they worship a quasi-Catholic figure. As a BBC piece from last year talks about it, to some, it may seem extraordinary, but priests say the country is under attack by Satan and that more exorcists are needed to fight him. This attack they say, is showing itself in the gruesome drug-related violence, including human sacrifice, that has engulfed the country since 2006. According to the latest official figures available, at least 70,000 people have died in this period, including gunmen, members of the security forces, and many innocent civilians. But, the priests say, it's not just the numbers, the savagery also stands out. We believe that behind all these big structural evils there is a dark agent, and his name is the demon. That is why the Lord wants to have here a ministry of exorcism and liberation for the fight against the devil, says Father Carlos Triana, a priest and exorcist in Mexico City. And allow me to interject, the Catholic Church is hiring or creating more exorcists worldwide because they're just certain Satan is here and he's going to kill us all. As much as we believe that the devil was behind Adolf Hitler, possessing and directing him, we also believe that he, the devil, is here behind the drug cartels. I want to point out that the Catholic Church did not exactly oppose Adolf Hitler. I know some people like to say the Catholic Church rolled over and aided and abetted Hitler. That's a bit of an oversimplification. Certainly in some areas they did do that. In other areas they actively opposed Nazism. However, the Pope at the time, I forget which one it was a rather anti-Semitic fellow, so I think it's safe to say that he was pretty kosher, or he was pretty hip to allowing Hitler to do whatever he wanted. Mexico's exorcists say there is unprecedented demand for their services. In Batista's view, the rising demand for exorcism is partly explained by the large numbers of Mexicans joining the cult of Saint Death or Santa Muerte. It's been a long time since my high school Spanish, and I wasn't that good at it then. Anyways, it is estimated that the cult, whose followers worship a skull in a wedding dress carrying a scythe, has some 8 million followers in Mexico, and more among Mexican immigrants in Central America, the U.S., and Canada. And it's just now hit me. I think the next time I'm on a message board and some asshat starts bitching about all the immigrants pouring into the United States and is basically advocating that we build, an armor, a fucking wall like they've got between North and South Korea on our southern border, that I bring this up and fuck with them that way. Anyways, it has also been adopted by the drug traffickers who ask her for help to avoid arrest and to make money, Batista says. In exchange, they offer human sacrifices, and this has increased the violence in Mexico. Another reason for the surge in exorcism, he argues, is the decriminalization of abortions in Mexico City in 2007. Both the cult and abortion have given evil spirits a foothold in the country, he insists. I'm not quite sure the logic of that, since you would think that they would... It's kind of pointless to possess an aborted fetus, but what do I know? Anyways, as I recall, drug cartel members who've been arrested after they've committed some kind of horrific ritual-style murder have admitted that they did it more to scare the local populace into keeping quiet than because they believed that they were invoking a supernatural being. I would not be surprised if it turned out that the poor kid lost his eyes in a ritual to the so-called Saint Death and not Satan, as the Daily Mail article claims. In either case, both these stories point out that even supposedly benign forms of religion, like Christianity, can lead to awful actions. As an atheist, none of us should care what happens to our bodies after death, so dismembering our corpse holds no terror for us. But to somebody who thinks that they can't get into heaven unless their body is buried in a certain way, chopping up their body is a credible threat. We also don't buy the bullshit that waving a dead chicken or what have you over a pentagram is going to do anything, so finding the remains of a supposed satanic ritual isn't going to terrify us. It just tells us that the folks we're after have a particular kink, as it were, or think that we're going to be scared by such stupid shit. Okay, the next story comes from IPS News. Arab region has world's fastest growing HIV epidemic. At a time when HIV rates have stabilized or declined elsewhere, the epidemic is still advancing in the Arab world, exacerbated by factors such as political unrest, conflict, poverty, and lack of awareness due to social taboos, aka religious prohibitions on things like homosexuality, women having access to birth control, etc., etc. Anyways, according to UNAIDS, the Joint United Nations Program on HIV/AIDS, an estimated 270,000 people were living with human immunodeficiency virus in the countries of the Middle East and North Africa region in 2012. It is true that the Arab region has a low prevalence of infection. However, it has the fastest growing epidemic in the world, warns Dr. Khadija Maola, an independent consultant on human rights, gender, civil society, and HIV/AIDS. The United Nations estimates that there were 31,000 new cases and over 16,000 new deaths in 2012 alone. Infections grew by 74% between 2001 and 2012, while AIDS-related deaths almost tripled, says Dr. Mata Mata, an infection specialist based at the Bellevue Hospital in Lebanon. However, both Maiola and Mata explain that figures can often be misleading in the region due to underreporting and the absence of consistent and accurate surveys. With the exception of Somalia and Djibouti, the epidemic is generally concentrated in vulnerable populations at higher risk, such as men who have sex with men, female and male sex workers, and injecting drug users. In Libya, for example, 90% of those in the latter category also live with HIV, notes Mata. Furthermore, adds Maola, most Arab countries do not have programs allowing for exchange of syringes. Do I have to say why this is bad? And why religion absolutely has a share in the blame for all of this? I'm going to assume that those of you out there listening to me don't need it spelled out. And I'm going to ask if you've heard of MERS. If you remember the SARS outbreak from a few years back, then you'll have an idea of what MERS is. A related virus, but one that hasn't captured the media attention to the extent that SARS did. One of the things which can happen when a person is infected with a disease like HIV is that it can cause mutations in other diseases the person might have. In some cases, these mutations can actually be beneficial. They can instill immunity in a person, or they can cause changes in one or another virus to make them more lethal or more transmissible. MERS is bad enough that it's got the World Health Organization twitchy and other groups like the CDC keeping a close eye on it, even if there haven't been too many stories about it in the mainstream press. I'm not saying that the exploding HIV cases in the Mideast will lead to MERS becoming a superbug, which threatens us all, but it will certainly make it harder to get an outbreak of MERS under control if MERS becomes slightly more widely spread. Additionally, it means that people with HIV who aren't being treated for HIV are more likely to die if they contract MERS, since they won't be on the various drugs which help to keep HIV in check. I believe I've mentioned the book The Hot Zone before. If you have not read it, read it. It's written by a respected journalist. It is not sensationalized at all, and it gives a good description of how a serious disease outbreak occurs, the concerns with it, and the unintended consequences of allowing it to rage out of control. And The Band Played On is another good example of a book that deals with that and that kind of situation. We really have to pay attention to these kinds of diseases because they put large numbers of people at serious risk. And, It doesn't even have to be, oh, well, they're going to kill us all. They're projecting in some places of Africa, people are going to be starving because it's so difficult with the Ebola outbreak to get food moved from one part of the country to another due to travel restrictions and people being scared to go anywhere. The diseases cause problems not just by killing people, but by disrupting their lives. And I know that in the case of MERS, there has been, although I think it may have been resolved favorably, but I don't remember the details, so I'm not going to claim anything. Anyways, in the case of MERS, it was first the virus was first sequenced by a company in Northern Europe. I think it was Norway. I might be wrong. They did it. The guy, whoever discovered the disease in the Mideast, did not have access in the Mideast to the necessary equipment to do a sequence, a DNA sequence of the disease, because that tells them things that they need to know to try and treat it or develop a cure for it. He sent it off to somebody in Norway he knew, who, when this person sequenced it, their company immediately put intellectual property on it. They copyrighted or patented something involving the disease, and now nobody wants to research it because of the way the patent is on whatever it was that the Northern European company did. Any treatment, any test, anything that somebody comes up with is going to fall under the under their umbrella of that patent, and they will have to pay that European company a royalty. So nobody wants to develop anything for it. I think that there was some kind of ruling, and somebody did something that fixed that because they realized, no, this is fucking stupid. A lot of people could die. But I could be wrong on that. Anyways, in slightly lighter news, this story comes from CarolinaLive.com. Cathedral Bible College President Reginald Wayne Miller pleaded guilty to fraud in foreign labor contracting, visa fraud, and willful failure to pay minimum wage fraud on Wednesday in federal court. According to a news release from the United States Attorney's Office, evidence presented at the hearing showed that Miller recruited foreign students to attend Cathedral Bible College, where he was president, by means of false representations and promises regarding employment. The release also says that Miller also made false statements on the related immigration documents for those student employees, and that once the students arrived in the United States, Miller violated the Fair Labor Standards Act by failing to pay the students the applicable minimum wage. The maximum penalty for fraud in foreign labor contracting is 5 years in prison and or a fine of $250,000. The maximum penalty for visa fraud is 15 years in prison or a fine of $250,000, and the maximum penalty for wage and hour violations is imprisonment for 6 years and or a fine of $10,000. Now, I wonder if they lumped them all in one count, so that if he screwed over 10 people, it's only one count for all those 10, or if it's individual counts for each of those 10 people. Because that could really rack up the fines. I mean, right now he's looking at paying, based on this, less than half, or just over $500,000. And if he's like big mega church preachers, that's probably what he's got rolling around in his couch. But anyways, all the various tax deductions one gets for running a church and a college weren't enough for this asshole. He had to engage in slave labor practices as well. You know, because Jesus. Okay. Our final religious story comes from IsraelNationalNews.com. Egyptian cleric, global Zionism behind Islamist terror. Senior Egyptian imam claims that fundamentalist terrorist groups are in the service of global Zionism. Global Zionism is apparently behind the jihadist terrorist organizations, at least according to a senior Egyptian cleric. Boy, they wrote that awkwardly. Anyways, Sheikh Ahmed Al-Tayeb, the Grand Imam of Al Azhar and president of Al-Azhar University, which is considered a prestigious Sunni Islam title, made the comments in a statement that aired on Egypt's Channel 1 on September 8th. He's not the only one to make such claims. Just last week, a similar comment related to the Islamic State group, ISIS, was made by an Iranian lawmaker. The lawmaker claimed that the United States, Israel, and Saudi Arabia have jointly created ISIS. The ISIS terrorist group is the joint product of the U.S., the Zionist regime of Israel, and Saudi Arabia in the region, and there is no doubt about that, claimed the spokesman for Iranian Parliament's National Security and Foreign Policy Committee, Saeed Hossein Naqvi Hosseini. Washington's claim to be fighting the ISIS is not real and is a lie, as the U.S. has never taken serious and practical measures to combat the terrorist group, Hosseini added. I don't know what they're spoken, but I'll have some as well.
I am endeavoring, ma'am, to construct a mnemonic memory circuit using stone knives and bearskins.
Developing World News. This section is where I cover news of interesting technological developments in the third world. As someone who grew up listening to missionaries talk about how they helped people in third world countries by teaching them about Jesus, I like to raise awareness of actual good being done in such places by people. This segment is brought to you with the help of Foundation Beyond Belief. Foundation Beyond Belief is a 501c3 charitable foundation created to focus, encourage, and demonstrate humanist generosity and compassion. Foundation Beyond Belief provides no compensation to me for this segment, and not all news stories in this segment are related to programs they're connected to. Basically, I told them if they helped me out a bit, I'd give them a free plug. This first story comes from BBC News. Alfredo Moser, bottle light inventor proud to be poor. Got to interject here. Alfredo Moser. I had a teacher in high school whose last name was Moser. She taught German. And this guy is a Brazilian, so he's Portuguese. So I'm wondering if he has some German ancestry or if she actually had Portuguese ancestry. I don't know. She's dead now, so I couldn't ask her. Anyways, Alfredo Moser's invention is lighting up the world. In 2002, the Brazilian mechanic had a light bulb moment and came up with a way of illuminating his house during the day without electricity, using nothing more than plastic bottles filled with water and a tiny bit of bleach. In the last 2 years, his innovation has spread throughout the world. It is expected to be in 1 million homes by early next year. So how does it work? Simple refraction of sunlight, explains Moser as he fills an empty 2-liter plastic bottle. Add 2 capfuls of bleach to protect the water so it doesn't turn green with algae. The cleaner the bottle, the better, he adds. Wrapping his face in a cloth, he makes a hole in a roof tile with a drill. And then from the bottom upwards, he pushes the bottle into the newly made hole. You fix the bottle with polyester resin. Even when it rains, the roof never leaks, not one drop. An engineer came and measured the light, he says. It depends on how strong the sun is, but it's more or less 40 to 60 watts, he says. It may not sound all that remarkable, but if you look at the photos that accompany the article, you'll see that it's a pretty dramatic improvement in how much light is available inside a building. It reminds me of what are called deck prisms, which were pyramidal hunks of glass that were placed into the decks of old wooden ships, which allowed light to filter down to the lower decks. Another benefit to people in developing nations, besides the low cost of installing the lights, is that they don't have to burn kerosene for light during the day, and this improves the air quality inside their homes. Oftentimes, the air inside homes in developing nations is awful because they're using a fire with no chimney or a poorly made chimney to cook their food, and this means that the interiors of their homes are filled with smoke. This leads to severe respiratory problems in kids, and a number of people die each year due to smoke inhalation or carbon monoxide poisoning because of it. Not to mention they're making use of something that would be thrown away as garbage, or worse, burned. This next story also comes from BBC News. Malawi app teaches UK pupils 18 months of maths in 6 weeks. An app designed to help provide a better education for children in Malawi has proved an equally effective learning tool for pupils in the UK. In 6 weeks, children made the same progress in maths as expected after 12 to 18 months of teaching. Education in Malawi is basic and overstretched. Classes of 90 are the norm, and in some instances, as many as 300 pupils share just one teacher. The situation has become worse following a recent population boom that means nearly half the country's population is below the age of 14. One-to-one teaching has become unthinkable, a luxury that the country's schooling system has been unable to provide. This is precisely what inspired Andrew Ash to co-found 1 Billion, a charity which aims eventually to help educate all of Malawi's children with its maths teaching app. The 1 Billion app improved the children's maths knowledge to a much greater extent than the alternative apps and, no surprise here, produced considerably better results than the average Malawian class with a pupil-teacher ratio of 90-1. And it didn't stop there. It turns out the app works just as well in the UK, even with class sizes of no more than 30, where a teacher is, at least in theory, able to give more attention to each child. In fact, 6 weeks' use of the app was found to accelerate the maths learning of the children by between 12 and 18 months. I'll have a link to the app in the show notes. It's iOS only, which is a bit surprising since Android devices are dirt cheap these days. Still, it just shows how things created for those in the developing world can help us in more advanced nations. I wish we had had something like that when I was a kid. I never really had any good math teachers except for the computer science teacher, who did a great job of explaining things needed for class projects but refused to actually teach math at our high school. I went to a very small high school, and the one math teacher we had was an asshole who didn't like children. That was according to the principal, by the way. I shouldn't say that he didn't like children, as he apparently sexually harassed some of his female students. This was back in the dark ages when sexual harassment wasn't even a term. Even when I went to college, the math professors I had weren't very good. I had one who'd tell the class as we were going over the answers to the previous day's homework assignment, "Now, you look at the answer you have on your paper, and you look at the answer written on the board, and you think to yourself, I got it wrong, but I know how to do the problem. I just forgot. And you know what? You're right." Talk about demeaning to adults. This fucking woman was. Another math professor I had gave us problems on tests which were unsolvable, by his own admission, because he wanted to see if we understood how to work the general formula. So we'd punch the numbers into our expensive graphing calculators, only to watch them shit themselves and have to re-enter everything because we thought we might have done something wrong. Eventually, you just wrote down the strange string of numbers your calculator gave you so you could move on to the next problem. I hope that the folks making this app continue to develop them and come up with advanced math apps so that idiots like me can finally learn the really hard stuff like trig, etc. Okay, the final story in this segment comes from Core 77. Load Carrier for Labor. Load Carrier for Labor is a The Load Carrier for Labor project is an innovation to improve the working conditions of laborers and workers at many places globally. Construction sites, factories, ports, railway stations, etc. The objective is to prevent various occupational hazards and demonstrating product design and ergonomic consideration for the welfare of human life. The principal object of the innovation is to facilitate 3 methods of lifting and shifting of the loads by worker, such as above the head, at the back, and push or pull action. The new device main structures are made from cane materials, plastic, and metal components. It is possible to make the entire structure in plastic or metal. The new design has two major parts, one that holds the load and the other that rests on the shoulder. The device has two knobs, which facilitates the change of required function manually from one to another in 1 minute duration. This allows 3 modular functions for carrying lighter loads on the head, medium loads on the back, and heavier loads to push or pull as a trolley. Ergonomically, the load is redistributed on the shoulder and at the lumbar support by softer material. The total weight of the device is 2 kilograms, about 4 pounds to those of us in America, and would cost approximately 300 rupees in mass production, roughly $5. It looks like a backpack frame with a pair of small wheels grafted onto one side. This is another one of those things which might not seem like much, but has the potential to have huge benefits for people in developing nations. Not only does it increase the amount which one person can easily carry, but also reduces the chances of injury to a person. Some news accounts I've read indicate that neck injuries are pretty common in societies where people carry things on their heads. In extreme cases, the weight of the object can drive the skull down onto the spinal column. This is not only fatal, but is a horrifically painful way to die, from what I understand.
Tea Earl Grey hot.
3D printing news. The ability to make nearly anything with the same ease as printing a document has powerful implications for our future. This first story comes from 3dprint.com. Local Motors unveils 3D printed car. When it comes to 3D printing, new breakthroughs and new achievements are being realized on an almost a daily basis. From 3D printable human tissue to a 3D printed life-size castle, and now a 3D printed automobile, the technology never ceases to amaze. This week at the International Manufacturing Technology Show in Chicago, Arizona-based automobile manufacturer Local Motors stole the show. Over the 6-day span of the IMTS, the company managed to 3D print and assemble an entire automobile called the Stratti live in front of spectators. Although the Stratti is not the first ever car to be 3D printed, the advancements made by Local Motors with the help from Cincinnati Incorporated and Oak Ridge National Laboratory have produced a vehicle in days rather than months. The car isn't entirely 3D printed, as the tires, steering wheel, seats, and other components like the engine are conventionally made. Nor is the car practical as anything other than a sports car, but it shows the direction the technology is headed in. If they can get the print time down to about a day or so, it'll only be slightly longer than what it takes companies like Nissan to build a car. Equally important, it can be done with fewer people and fewer machines. I've worked in the Nissan plant in Smyrna for a couple of different subcontractors, and it takes large numbers of both people and machines to assemble a car. Okay, this next story comes from the Huffington Post and just proves that kids today have some of the coolest shit imaginable. Prosthetic hands are great. Prosthetic Wolverine claws are even better, especially when you're designing and building them for children in need, as Aaron Brown has done. Brown, a 3D printing enthusiast in Grand Rapids, Michigan, volunteers for a global organization called Enabling the Future, which designs and prints prosthetic fingers and hands for people in need. In preparation for last month's Grand Rapids Maker Fair, a festival which promotes invention, creativity, and resourcefulness, Brown Modified enables free prosthetic hands plans, building an edition with Wolverine-inspired claws he thought would appeal especially to children. Now, the claws are clearly plastic, but holy shit, as bad as it must suck to lose a hand, having a replacement hand modeled after Wolverine or Iron Man or some other superhero, it's got to be a great consolation prize. Even better is that it's cheap, so the kid can swap them out on a whim. It reminds me of a character in some 80s TV series who had a mechanical hand that he could swap out fingers to use as tools for doing his job. In the one episode I can remember, he installs a drill on one of his fingers and uses it to drill out a lock. I wish I could remember what that show was. I have no idea. I thought it was Spencer for Hire, but it's not. Okay, this next story comes from Gizmodo. In the Boxtrolls, 3D printing makes stop-motion animation look magical. Stop-motion is a taxing, tedious process. A film will start with a story. In this case, it was a very detailed story based on the children's book Here Be Monsters by Alan Snow. Then the studio will move to 2D designs, then renders, then actually physically building puppets and sets. The process has essentially remained the same since for decades and decades. But recently, stop-motion animators have been able to do more, and the Boxtrolls is one of the biggest, if not the biggest, stop-motion productions ever created. By and large, that's thanks to 3D printing, which allows creators to make facial kits with every possible expression all on the computer, then print them out. God, these bloggers and their fucking fast times. Proofread, fuckers! Proofread! Sorry. That's tedious as it is, but it's not even getting to the tip of the iceberg. The Boxtrolls had 79 sets, more than 20,000 props, and one hero or main puppet for each character, dozens of replicas for various poses and stunts, and thousands of expressions for their little faces. And humans have to move each teeny-weeny part. In past stop-motion productions, someone in the faces department, Leica's largest department, would have to create by hand a new face for every single expression a puppet made. Now they can render them on a computer and print out each one in brighter, more nuanced color and print them out more quickly than hands could make them. How does that translate into what you see on a movie screen? The film Coraline, for example, had 207,000 possible expressions total. Eggs, the hero in Boxtrolls, had about 1.4 million. The article contains 3 video clips from the upcoming film, and it's impressive work. The movements and facial expressions are amazingly smooth with tremendous detail. I don't know how they managed to get the blends of colors in the characters' faces that they did, as I didn't think that the full color machines could get that complex, but apparently they can. Or the article is wrong and they did actually hand paint them afterwards. But just watch one of the clips on the article. It's worth it just to see what they can do with it. And it does look like it'd actually be an entertaining kids film, too. Okay, the final story in the segment also comes from Gizmodo. A few minutes after 2 a.m. tonight, a SpaceX Dragon commercial cargo craft will lift off from Cape Canaveral in Florida carrying something that's never been taken into space, a 3D printer. When it docks with the ISS, it will deliver the first machine capable of making things in orbit, a huge step forward for exploration. The idea of manufacturing in space is practically as old as the idea of space travel itself. Shooting things into orbit takes a remarkable amount of fuel, so putting even a small amount of material in space comes at a steep price. That's why the lure of a machine that can fabricate tools, parts, and even structures once in orbit is so attractive. But until tonight, it has never been tested using contemporary technology like 3D printing. Unfortunately, the launch has been delayed by weather, and it looks like the earliest it'll be going up is the 23rd of this month. But still, holy fuck, folks, we're living in the future. As someone whose earliest memories are of the Apollo program and who thought we'd be living on Mars by now, it has been rather depressing with what's been happening with the manned program at NASA for some time. This, along with the new rocket announcement, gives me a bit of hope that we might yet see humans on Mars before I kick off. If we don't, and there's an afterlife, I'm going to be so pissed for all eternity. Okay. We're a little bit under on time, but if I add another story, it'll kick me way over, so I'm just going to call it an episode. Thanks for listening. You can follow the show on Twitter, Park Atheist is the show's Twitter handle, and it's also on Facebook at facebook.com/trailerparkatheist. You can email me at trailerparkatheist@gmail.com. Show notes can be found at trailerparkatheist.blogspot.com. If you happen to like the podcast, please rate it on iTunes. The next episode should be a chapter from Bible myth. Well, it will be a chapter from Bible myths and their parallels in other religions. The question is if I'll get time to cut another episode after that, and I won't know until after I get this one edited and posted, etc., etc. Anyways, say goodnight, Fuzznuts. Damned cat.
All I know is this violates every canon of respectable broadcasting.